You're listening to the Zealous Podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week, Zack DiChristino is joining me, and he is a physical therapist, but primarily the national team physical therapist for USA Climbing. He's also the medical manager for USA Climbing. So if you're not familiar with bouldering, speed climbing, or lead climbing, well, stay tuned because you're going to learn a lot, especially as this is an emerging Olympic sport and will be here next year in France for the 2024 Olympics. Give a listen, follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder, and click subscribe. Enjoy the show. Thanks for being on, Zealous. I would love to know, what was the road you took to get to where you are now? I mean, you were mentioning it before we started, you had some time at Stanford. What were you doing up there?
So at Stanford, so I was recruited at first to kind of help start their outpatient physical therapy to the general public because there wasn't a department. So the director at the time had a sort of a vision that was an area that their department could grow, and it just happened to be at a time where the Stanford was building a brand new outpatient clinic that would be all encompassing, like sleep health and dermatology, what you name it. And so it was going to be this brand new, I forget what the cost of the campus was, but within that space was going to be physical therapy. And because Stanford at that time didn't have an outpatient department, they were thinking about outsourcing it to like a private practice. And I think the vision was to try to keep everything in network, everything Stanford Health, which is now called Stanford Healthcare, I believe. So I was recruited as basically their first outpatient PT, and it just started small with, being involved in some of the meetings about moving towards this direction. My experience was just working from, my original position was from Vail Health, which was Howard Head Sports Medicine, which is the physical therapy clinic within that space, underneath that umbrella. And we worked really closely with the Stedman Clinic, which is pretty world-renowned. So I had just a lot of sports, physical therapy, orthopedic background and training already under my belt. And it just happened to be that one of the physicians at Stanford was a fellow at Stedman at the time. So we kind of knew of each other. And it just started with me observing surgeries, starting to see his patients, and, fortunately having good outcomes with his patients. And we kind of went from there. So what was like basically a year-long project, and then that did transform into one therapist going to 13 therapists. And then like when I left that space after a couple years, switching to the athletic department at Stanford, they had already outgrew that space. It just exploded. So that was kind of cool to see.
That must be nice to be a part of something successful like that, for sure. Yeah. But so I'm curious, you just mentioned you transitioned over to the athletic training department or the athletic department. But you were seeing the general population. What was that transition like, going from general population with all these orthopedic issues and post-surgical rehab and so on to vibrant young athletes at the college level?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the biggest things you notice is, I guess you could say like the young athletes, especially at that caliber, right, at Stanford, was, those were the types of patients you had to kind of keep on a leash a little bit. So they were just so motivated, ambitious, wanted to get better. So you didn't have to, I guess, sort of convince them as much. But I will say it also kind of spoils you a bit because you have such healthy young athletes who can heal like that, and they do everything you tell them. They also have, that was the other big thing, is you saw this big support system, athletic trainers, strength conditioning, performance coaches. And that was one of the sort of the transitions I had to make, is working with such a larger team, which was really cool. It really did kind of open your eyes to what sports medicine is and how it can be very successful and, top notch. But you're coming from obviously a population that has a lot more comorbidities. And so in a way, like, I don't want to say it made me soft switching, of course, because it had its own challenges, that sort of demographic, the collegiate athlete and the politics and all those things. But I think it better set you up because you just were experienced with dealing with so much more variables. right? You had to really kind of have the attention to detail when you were working with patients that had multiple things going on. And, and at that time, and what we know now, how important mental health is, but retrospectively looking back is just thinking about how those patients were dealing with a lot of issues and outside just their injury or why they were seeing you. So,
Yeah, I could definitely see the compliance factor being a big difference
yeah.
between general pop and Division One athletes, as well as, with the general population, it would seem that there's only so much you can do with this individual. So you didn't have as much to choose from in a way. It was like
Right.
a small menu, and you could just choose from one page. Where you go over to the college level athlete, and now you've got this IHOP menu that has 10 pages of options. So you had so many more decisions in a way when it came to programming or in terms of rehab
Okay.
programming and so on, and the different elements and the fact that they are so compliant. Like, what was that like? Like, do you know what I mean? Like the scope of what you could offer the general pop compared to the athlete. Did you find that that was the case?
Yeah, like so I'm kind of glad you brought that up. That was like definitely kind of a relieving factor in that insurance. I mean, although, the athletes still had insurance, but sort of the agreement was as long as the athlete was on the roster, or let's say they got injured while training or during competition, and let's say they medically retired even, they still would get care up to a year, or let's say your typical ACL reconstruction, which can take 8 to 9 months, right? Well, after like, most, if you're in the general public, your insurance maybe pays up to 3 months, and then from there you're kind of on your own. Well, like they just basically kept getting treated until they were better. And
Wow.
so it didn't make you more relaxed in terms of your planning and your programming. You still try to hit timelines and deadlines and milestones very similarly, if not faster in some ways. And you did have sort of the pressure of coaching, coaches, and, if it was a star player or something like that, we call a game changer player. But I will say there was almost more pressure on with the general public because you had a very finite amount of visits and time. So, and you probably are experienced with it that, a patient comes in and they're like, I get 6 visits. That's all I get. And you're like, wow. So really have to think about how to use those visits, how to space them out in terms of, okay, we know someone's going to hit a milestone here and their progression is going to change, the program's going to change. So let's meet up that time and reassess and kind of add that program, and you kind of keep trying to spare their visits for the most impactful times, and then it does make you try to be more of a, I don't want to say a salesman, but more convincing of how important their home exercise program is and their compliance, because you only have those 6 visits together, whereas the athlete, you're seeing them 3 times a week and even through the summer, and and indefinitely sometimes. So
Yeah, in a way, that is their career, the
yeah.
athletic pursuit, compared to general pop that have lifestyles outside of this. And this is just one little sliver that they may benefit from if they're seeing it in real time. So, with your time spent at Stanford, what was next? I mean, you obviously left there because you're with USA Climbing.
Yeah, so actually, I mean, part of it was a personal decision and an economic decision, although when I tell you this, you'll probably laugh. So like I've been climbing before I was ever a PT. So I started in undergrad and then eventually, I went to grad school in Colorado for PT. But climbing was like, at that time, I didn't have really any other sports I was doing other than running and a little bit of weight training and things like that. And so I just kind of got hooked to it. And then when I applied to PT school, I narrowed it down to UCSF and UC Colorado. And I'll, shamelessly tell you, Colorado was a choice because of the outdoor climbing, but
Heck yeah.
also, it was a good school. Um, but yeah, so yeah, the transition from Stanford was more of a decision to go back to some roots of climbing and the mountain culture, because I just loved the mountains and had spent a good amount of time there before I went to Stanford. Part of the reason was economically, like I couldn't see myself being long term in the Bay Area, so it was kind of like, okay, At that time, I think they said you had to make 300 grand to be able to buy a home. And so I was like, well, that's not happening. But I actually went back to Vail Health, and it was, I didn't know it at the time, but that is probably a good segue of how I got into USA Climbing, because there's some things happening there. And then one of my buddies, and he was the VP of our clinics, was a big climber. And at that time, when I moved back, a couple big things happened. We were in the talks with USA Climbing, which at that time they were based in Boulder, Colorado. And they, at that time, as a NGB, they had no medical support, nothing. Like, so, I mean, at that time, they didn't have a head coach for their team. Their athletes would just kind of show up to competitions on their own. They usually had to pay for it themselves, or maybe their sponsor would pay for it. So you just imagine it was just nothing, no support really. And so he was kind of talking to them of how that could work out between being like a medical partner for USA Climbing in their team. And it started really small, and it's grown to what it is today. So
Fantastic. And how long have you been with USA Climbing?
So like as a full-time member, to just kind of show you how new it is, 2020, August 2020. But I've been involved with them in some capacity as a contracted PT, or as through this medical partnership through Vail. Vail Health is since 2016. So we initially, kind of our sort of partnership was that, if climbers had the means to come to Vail and see a specialist at Stedman Clinic or Vail Orthopedics, and then get therapy through us. That was one of the sort of arrangements. And then also we as PTs would travel with the team to probably 2 or 3 events a year, which is not a lot when I will eventually tell you how many events are actually do happen. So we would cover the youth national team when they went to world championships, which is usually like a 2-week event. And then we would cover the adult team, same idea, we're at world championships. And then at that time, there was always a World Cup event competition in Vail. So we hosted it. And so we would just kind of be in our backyard, and we'd send like 5 or 6 PTs just to support the whole, provide medical coverage basically. So.
Wow. And I imagine the 2020 Olympics must have had some kind of shot in the arm for USA
for sure.
Climbing. I mean,
Yeah,
it was the first time that climbing was appeared in the Olympics. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the first thing was my friend Nico, who had the vision to start this medical partnership. And that kind of, really got our foot in the door, and my foot in the door, as I got to know these young athletes, and then some that actually went to the Olympics. So I started working with them very early, before we even knew the Olympics was even a thing for them. And so then, we start hearing like around 2018, and then 2019 is when we kind of really knew that it was like on the provisional list, and then it fully got accepted for Tokyo. And so then you have USOPC support to some degree. So, and that can work a couple different ways. Like the way we understood it was, if you already had a person, or if the team already had a person that they want to use, then the USOPC could support that in a certain way. Or you could align with, say, a clinic or a company, private practice or something like that. And so, so eventually it started out with aligning with Vail Health, or Howard Head, the clinic I worked for. And I was basically, as we got a little bit more support from the USOPC, we had a little bit more money to send me to more events. And so one of those events was, every year there's a World Cup event that goes to Japan. And so I went to that event because it was almost like a little bit of reconnaissance. So we kind of like were going to do the competition, but the staff was also there to look at a host city, which is like what some Olympic teams do, is they'll go to this host city, the city will support them, and they stay there before they actually go into the athlete village. And so they were making all those plans. And like little by little, I started doing a little bit more travel with the team, but was never with them, in their training, because we didn't even have like a hub for them. We didn't have a training center. We basically had our headquarters, but athletes lived all over like the States. And so you can imagine they didn't really get together to train much. They just kind of showed up to the competition as a team, and then, they would compete. And that's kind of like been the biggest changes in the last 3 years.
And so when it comes to competition, I
Yeah.
just to be honest, I grew up rock climbing in my early teenage years, but this was in the rock quarries south of Boston and up through the granite state of New Hampshire, maybe a little bit out in Western Mass. So, and I loved it. I mean, being not that tall, it could be a really great for a short man sport, so to speak. But this is completely different. You're not as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong. There's different events with climbing competitions. There's bouldering, there's speed climbing, and there's either lead or sport climbing. Is that correct?
Lead climbing, yeah, is what we call
Lead
it.
climbing.
Yeah.
Okay. And so those themselves, I mean, are going to have certain demands, physical demands, one compared to another. Maybe bouldering and lead climbing, definitely I could see them being very similar in the energy demands in terms of conditioning. Speed climbing, that's just explosiveness, grip, throw, jump, grip, and so on, how fast you can get to the top. You're in a unique spot, I think, Zach. I mean, compared to other PTs that I've had on the podcast, from whether it be the NBA or the NFL or National Hockey League or whatever, because you're dealing a lot more with fingers and toes. You're dealing with the digits more so than probably any other sport, which is that fairly accurate?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the injury rates, and I'm pretty, freshly caught up with all the current literature because I got to do a CSM presentation next week on hand and upper body extremity injuries. But yeah, fingers are number one, like hands down, like 40% of injury rates, and of those injuries, overuse injuries are predominantly like 80%. So that tells you a lot, right? And then like second to fingers are shoulders, then elbows, if we're talking about the upper extremity. And the upper extremity is predominantly the area that gets most affected. Like all the lower extremity are more acute injuries because of falls and accidents and rock climbing accidents. But we are starting to see, even in the competition setting, because of the way the setting sometimes can be, is we're starting to see more knee injuries with certain maneuvers, like the heel hooking maneuver. So we're starting to see LCL sprains. We're starting to see meniscus tears, popliteus injuries, hamstring strains. And then because some, arguably the setting, the more so the bouldering discipline, because you can fall, is they're taking big falls. And so you're going to see the ankles, you're going to see knee injuries, you see dislocated elbows once in a great while. And then even this year, for the first time, we saw 3 or 4 concussions. So that's something that you probably didn't think about before, but thanks to some of my training at Stanford, working with the football team, I mean, you already knew the screens, and for me, like, it was always, as a medical provider, and if you're the first responder for the team, in some situations, you got to be prepared, right, for anything. So
certainly. So, I've got several friends, colleagues that are physical therapists, and one thing I've been talking to them about lately is the educational path that they took through physical therapy school, and how the primary focus was on acute injury care. And physical therapists are phenomenal with acute rehab. Yet they are trying to take the same protocol and apply it to more chronic injuries of repetitive motions and so on, when that actually is not all that effective. It needs to be a different mindset, one that is more integrative rather than a concentrated area of the body. So I guess long-winded about this, but with the upper extremities being more chronic and overuse, and the lower portions being more acute, do you have different protocols? Do you have a different approach when talking about fingers, hands, elbows, and shoulders than you do about groin, ankles, and knees?
Yeah, I would say so it's gotten a lot better, and especially when you're talking about strength and conditioning, exercises, much less principles. that's something that you're starting to see within the, general climbing community. You're starting to see people do deadlifts and more lower body strengthening. And so, but you have to think about historically these young athletes growing up, and all they did was mostly climb, and they would do a bunch of pull-ups and maybe they did some fingerboarding and things like that, and a lot of upper body based. And so a lot of them would come pretty deficient in their lower body. And so, like for me now, since I'm with basically these athletes, 5-6 days a week, almost every week of the year, like me just watching them, climb and then jumping down from boulders, like what you would just you just would observe, right? You're like, okay, that person's landing stiff-legged, that person's not bending their knees and absorbing, and then they come to you and they're complaining about back problems, and you're like, okay, well, like you don't need back rub, you need you need some conditioning for your lower body and maybe some neuromuscular education, and so I think it's like there's consistencies, that there's preventative stuff, but I would say more so for the lower body from a strengthening and neuromuscular sort of standpoint, if you know what I mean, is getting some of the basics we've learned from high impact sports and soccer and basketball and applying it to some degree and making it a little bit more climbing specific, of course, in terms of them doing that in their off season and then to their preseason. And then, like I tell them, I was like, once you got it done, it's in you and it's going to help you prepare, and hopefully keep you healthy through the rest of the season. I think the challenge of the upper body is you do have a few of them. You'll see, just scapular dyskinesia, or you'll be doing a pull-up really weird, like we know, like as you do a pull-up, we should be seeing the the scapula rotate down, and but you would see the opposite. They'll be shrugging their shoulders as they're pulling up. So you start to think, okay, maybe we start incorporating some rowing on the rings and rowing exercise to incorporate the rhomboids and things like that. And so, but as you probably know with climbing, like there's so much diversity with movement, right? There's a gazillion types of movement you could have, and you can cheat those movements, right? Like especially like if you're climbing a problem or a route, you can still climb the route and still get away with not moving great, and maybe get away with not hurting yourself, but we know that's not good for a shoulder or an elbow. And so you look at the mechanics on the wall, or when they start getting kind of pumped in what they're doing with their elbows and their shoulders, how that might even like translate to a finger issue, like just they're over gripping because their hands like being forced to open up. And then I think the other big thing is training programming, is like a lot of thing I do with some of our elite athletes is just it's just basic stuff that you and I know, but to them, it's like, oh, never thought about that. We never thought about a deload week. I never thought about, like, I had one young climber who was just doing a gazillion exercises for her fingers, hangboarding really heavy, doing contact strength, like on a campus board. And then she'd boulder really hard on the spray wall. And it's like, well, hold on a second. I was like, your fingers are going to just be blasted and you're going to hurt yourself. So there's times to do all this within a training cycle and phase it right. So like this time you work maybe on strength first, and then you start working on things like of RFD and, power and things like that. So I think maybe those who don't know competition climbing well, like it's such a young age group. It's like, in the adult category, you're talking about 16, and maybe most of them, up to like 22. And then if you're 25 and 26, you're old man. So these are a lot of kids that don't know basic sports science principles and training principles, unless they have a coach, and that's kind of not always guaranteed they're going to have a coach that understands that. So
Yeah, and so where we probably decrease our mobility the most is during growth rates, right? Growth spurts, so to speak.
yeah.
And you're dealing with a lot of your athletes that are either going through them or just past them. So I wonder, what I'm curious about, Zach, is do you have any type of assessment process, protocol, screening that you've developed or you use that is specific to climbing? Are you looking for like how well can they extend through their fingers? What is their wrist extension, flexion? radial and ulnar deviation? Are you looking joint by joint at all of those? Are you able to do that, or is it just by athlete, depending on what pops up?
Yeah, so because I think we're like me and even the head coach, like the head coach was basically hired just a few months before I was. And so I think both our approach was realizing that a lot of these young athletes didn't know us, didn't trust us, and so we wouldn't get a lot of buy-in. So we didn't want to say make things mandatory, some things mandatory. And so the way I had some ideas in the beginning where I thought, okay, maybe every Wednesday we would do as a team, like a little, like I would do just like a little presentation about a general topic. But I realized, like, I mean, as you know, if you go to Con Ed classes, like maybe 50% of that, 40% of that you find valuable, and maybe, you pick out the golden nuggets of it, right? And so I'd rather, what I'd switch to is making it just more of like the athlete could just schedule, a meeting with me, and we could just discuss whatever topic they wanted to talk about. So that was one thing. So if they wanted to talk about training, programming, if they want to talk about obviously an injury or anything like that. And then at that time, I was developing in a screen. I do have one. It's pretty extensive. It almost takes like probably in its current version, like, an hour and a half to go through, because I am going through, I won't say joint by joint, but I'm starting to deduce what I think is the most important things to check, like wrist extension, because we know, like, I mean, some of these climbers, like their finger flexors so tight, they can barely like, bend their wrist back 45 degrees, and they're getting dorsal impingement and all those things. And then a lot of them are tight in their pectoral muscles, their lats. Some of them have, like, they can't really do the froggy, the Faber kind of range of motion in their hips, which is, kind of been linked to. They did this one study, and you take it with a grain of salt, but in terms of hip mobility for a climber in competition climbing, what they found was abduction is like one of the more important abilities in the sort of like the froggy, position,
Sure.
because you got to open up your hips and you got to be able to span sometimes. So that's like one that I maybe look more at all the time because of its relevance. And then hamstring flexibility for some. So, like, just to give you an example, I did this with a couple athletes and noticed that there was a lot of hip mobilities with this person. So if they're bouldering, as you know, like if they can't get their hips in a certain position, then they're trying to make up for it in their back, and that might explain why they're getting all this back tightness. You start linking everything together. You're looking at ankle dorsiflexion mobility, because when they step on these big volumes where they have to smear, you have to get as much of your rubber on that hold to stay on the hold. So you got to drop your heels down. So you think of it like as a like performance, obviously, and then you think of it obviously from like especially the shoulders, like injury prevention as well. So I do like definitely a lot of mobility, range of motion testing. Now, movement wise, there's kind of a disagreement in the community if it's valuable not to or not to do a screen. I think it is, but I don't do, maybe I look at a pull-up. Maybe I look at some degree how strong they are with pressing, because they're kind of notoriously not strong with pressing, like doing dips. Like they'll be lucky if they can do 6 dips with their body weight, much less bench press their body weight. And then I get to just basically see them climb all the time on we have this big spray wall, gigantic spray wall. So I'm just like literally just watching them all the time, and I'll just make mental notes, because there's been some climbing PTs, like younger climbing PTs, that ask me, do I use these system boards, that are very symmetrical in nature, and then you could look side to side. And I think that's definitely a valuable too. But they're also doing movements that are kind of below their capability, if you know what I mean. Like those moves are pretty predictable, controlled on holds that are very good for them. But our spray wall is like brutal. It's like hard, and it's the type of holds they'll be using in a competition, like a lot of open-handed, big fat holds, not all crimps. And they're having to like jump and dyno to them and swinging, a million gazillion ways. So that to me is like more, I mean, I just had the luxury of having that. So that's to me like they're actually doing the thing they'll be doing in a comp, right? Demand wise, and doing that like 3 or 4 hours straight, so
Sure.
yeah.
So I got so many questions now. One being, you're mentioning how their pecs are shortened, their shoulders are coming forward. Is that primarily due to overdevelopment of the lats and causing internal rotation of
Yeah,
the
I
arm?
think it partly is, but I also have sort of, I guess, a theory that it's also how they move, decide to pull, quote unquote, pull. So what I noticed, there are times when you're pulling and you want to get closer to the wall, you do kind of round your shoulder and sort of protract the scapula and roll your shoulder in, your elbow flares out. That's a lot of, what I see is a lot of pec minor tightness. Of course, the lats can get tight, and I kind of always say they're like swimmers. Like if you look at their posture and everything, they're kind of swimmers. They're like internally rotated in their shoulders, and they got like a little bit of the thoracic kyphosis, and so they're kind of sometimes underdeveloped in their posterior chain. So that's another thing, like especially like the glutes, and then obviously some of the extensors, the back extensors. So having to do things like Supermans and glute bridges and things like that. But let's see, what was your question again?
No, that was it. That was
Yeah.
right there. And then
Yeah.
just going down, that was great.
Yeah.
I'm curious now about the feet and the forefoot in particular. Do you find that these climbers have a greater degree of inversion, eversion in the forefoot, and the rear foot is more gunked up, so to speak, because they're having to wedge in or have these toe holds? Do you notice any kind of disparity there? Do you check with that?
I think the thing I notice more, other than just, since a little kid wearing their shoes so much, you just see you see some deformities, you got a little hallux valgus going on in some of them. But I think it's partly, my theory is with some of them, and especially when you get their history, their athletic history, is some of them just been doing nothing but climbing. So their feet never got strong through maybe, like, I don't know
Impact
your
and loading.
background, but yeah, my sports were basketball, baseball, football, martial arts, skateboarding, and then a lot of running after that. So like for me, and granted, everyone has certain development of, their joints and their alignment. But what I notice is more than anything is that they're just underdeveloped, which is kind of like interesting, right? Because you think, like, for how much time they're spending on their toes and everything, like I don't doubt they're really strong through like their toe flexors and things like that, but they're also wearing shoes nowadays that, keep their toes like pretty scrunched up. So it's almost like providing them, a support, if you will, so they don't have to work as hard, and they're wearing their shoes really tight, so it's really kind of not very forgiving. um so, and then I will see, probably the thing I see in some of the females is, maybe in a good way, is they do have like a lot of ankle dorsiflexion. I mean, they just have more than 30 degrees easily, which in their case is kind of an advantage in some situations when they're doing certain kind of moves and stuff like that. But what I see mostly is, probably a lack of intrinsic strength. Just looking, if you just have them stand and they're just, flat arches, and one's, I have one right now, she's like one of our best climbers, and she's got a big hallux valgus thing going on now, and has like arch pain, just, and it's not from climbing. It's like, it's funny, when we go to competitions, we generally have to walk around a lot and stuff and carry our bags, and so her biggest complaint is walking around in her shoes, or in her street shoes. And so we've, in her case, it was more of like going back to some basics when I used to work with track and field at Stanford, is, do a good foot biomechanic assessment. In this case, give her some intrinsics to do. But also, in the meantime, we give her just like a general sort of arch support, and then just recommend certain footwear when we have to do a lot of walking, as we're traveling. So like, she's just not wearing, Crocs or something.
So with these athletes and the three different events, how many of them are typically specialists versus, say, all around that compete in all or at least more than one event?
Yeah. So this is kind of where the Olympics has influenced us over the last several years, since, even before Tokyo. So I don't know if you got to watch any of it, or sort of understood sort of the format. So yeah, Tokyo was very, that will never happen again. I'll just put it that way, probably, is that
How so? What do you mean?
you had to do all three disciplines for a combined score. So you couldn't skip out on one. You had to, and so when you qualified, you did it in the same format. So then what happened was, it was pretty interesting. Like, the athletes that say specialized in bouldering or lead, and those are the two that obviously you're going to have the more crossover, because they're pretty similar.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say if you look at the international circuit, that's what you see mostly. I mean, you will still have a boulder specialist and you'll still have a lead specialist, of course. And then speed was his own specialty. But then for Tokyo, then you had people training all three, like they had to. And so, I mean, once they got to the Olympics, you could still see that they were still very much a speed, specialist, because they would dominate and then they would not do as well in the other disciplines. So now, like, moving toward Paris, and we don't know for LA 28 what it's going to be. It's a little different, where you have what we call a combined bouldering and lead team. So you're doing both bouldering and lead for a combined score, and then speed is its own thing. So now you're going to see all the speed specialists at their best, the best in the world, that will be able to qualify for the Olympics, whereas before they were probably hindered by these other disciplines.
Certainly.
And then if you look at, like, if I had to make bets right now, like if you look at all the teams and all the athletes, what I would say is that a lot of those athletes already kind of did both disciplines for the most part. They maybe started maybe more heavily in one. But I think now, since the beginning of Tokyo, they're already kind of pretty developed in both. But it is interesting where you'll see, for instance, Japan has like this guy, Tomoa, who dominated bouldering. I mean, the guy was just phenomenal. And you could see as he started to have to train the other ones, he wasn't so dominant, because he had to, he got spread a little thin. I mean, he's still very good, of course.
Specificity, though.
Yeah. And it's just because when you look at competition bouldering, it's now turned into a little parkour, it's turned into a little bit of gymnastics. It's a lot of hand-eye coordination and just, bizarro kind of powerful moves. And there's now even what we call power tech moves, where you're just on, like, little jibs and crimps, but you're jumping from these things and, spinning in the air. So it's really fun to watch nowadays. It's a little nerve-wracking for me as a medical provider, but and maybe to dive into a little bit more of that, of what's kind of driving now this combined, is like, if you want to qualify for the Olympics, you have to do both, right? You have to qualify in that format, and so, like, for us as a US team, and the support we get from, funding wise, is, it's kind of like, it's hard to argue against, but it's also, I guess for specialists, it's probably hard to swallow, is that money goes towards this combined team and a speed team, and not your single disciplines as much. And then because it's an Olympic qualifying year, so you have to kind of weigh it a little heavier, in that you're giving, where that money's coming from is then has to be used towards supporting these teams and athletes.
Well, I could see, as this is growing too, that they will break the bouldering and lead climb into individuals, just like gymnastics or track and field. There's going to be a decathlon, there's going to be an all around that's going to, and so that's one category in itself. But I'm just thinking about the conditioning and the physical demands between speed climbing and the other two, and it's just night and day. It's just, so you're probably not going to find somebody that's an elite speed climber doing well when it comes to all three, and for that matter, just the opposite. So it's almost like it needs its own category when you're considering all around. So so gearing up to a year away, we're a year and a half away from 24 in Paris or in France. What's your role? What are you looking toward right now? It's going to take a while to get the national team formed. Of course, it's only probably going to be just months before the Olympics, but leading up to that, what's going on?
So it's mostly, I mean, we definitely have, you don't want to use the word favorites, but if you had to bet, we have some pretty good contenders, especially on the women's side. We have a couple. One actually, was an Olympian, and she made the finals in Tokyo. And so now that we have, like I said, this training center, which we've now had since 2020 or late 2019, is now it's starting to, and it's located here in Salt Lake City. We've kind of developed now, like more athletes are kind of coming here. So what that allows, our coach obviously is to coach them. And so basically what a normal week looks like is like 5-6 days a week. Our training center's open, and sometimes we're doing 2 a days, and so what that looks like for me is in the morning, they're usually pretty more concentrated with the coach and training, and I'm just there if they have any little niggles or something like that. And like a couple of the athletes always kind of check in with me, just because we have that kind of rapport. And then for some of them, I do kind of structure their program off the wall. So whether it's like maybe a little bit more like going back to the screen, like maybe it is a little bit more specific strengthening, doing some ring work, or unilateral exercises for stability, glute activation, or it's for some of them it's rehab session. And then for some of it's weight training, like so the speed climber, we don't have many speed climbers here now, but we do have basically our top one that lives here. And he and I have been working together over the last year and had really good results. And he was already pretty versed in like weight training. What he needed help with was structure over the off season into the in season, because before I start working with him, I'd see him like just working so hard. But he would be doing a gazillion plyometrics, and they were all kind of like little too like overlapping. I was like, well, just realized recovery wise, like the impact of that also is it's kind of redundant. So let's maybe narrow it down to what is the most valuable. And that's kind of the cool thing with he and I, is that we've kind of come up with specific types of movements within those plyometrics or specific strength that are more climbing specific. So an example is like something we're trying new this year is most of them would just do pistol squats, and that's good. That's definitely valuable and applicable. But when you think about like them on the wall, they're mostly feet turned, hips externally rotated in that froggy position. They're not like straight on, and so like stability wise it's harder, and also a bit of different muscle activation, you could argue, not straight on. So it's a little easier to do just a pistol straight on pistol squat versus doing what I call a single leg plie squat.
Mm-hmm.
And then adding into that like a kettlebell overhead press for stability, because some of them don't do even core. I mean, a lot of them do, but some don't do like a lot of core stability in what we know it as, right? They think they are because they're doing planks and levers and things like that. But you try to get them to do, especially if something related to the posterior chain, they really struggle. It's pretty interesting for how strong these athletes are. But you can always find that little weakness.
Sure.
So
What about like I'm just thinking with that plie pistol squat or the plie single leg squat, there's a good deal of torque on that knee, and that VMO better light up, or else the strain's going to be applied to the ACL, and we could even bring in glute ham complex to help that VMO out. So do you like do you target that in another way, or you're just looking to see how valgus is this going, how much external rotation of the tibia compared to the femur, like what is it that you're looking for when you're doing that?
Yeah, I mean, at first, like, as part of the assessment, I will have them do just a basic single leg squat for reps. And so you're just basically looking at proximal stability, valgus varus, moments and things like that. And obviously, if they have trouble with that, then you have to start with the basics. And I've had to do that with some of them, even like hip hinging for some of them, is kind of a foreign thing, So that's one thing we're working on with one of the speed climbers, is just like, trying to move more properly through your hips to get taller to go up, right? Versus going into the wall. Or what it was funny that what I was noticing with him, we were doing like a sort of an agility exercise where it was just kind of rapid feet, toe touches on a box, flexing your knees and your hips rapidly, right? But he would always be in this flexed position, right? Like he wouldn't be extended at the hips, he wouldn't be upright. And then we had we get support from the USOPC, like the strength and conditioning coach there. And so she came for a visit and we just kind of worked together, and we just start realizing like his mechanics throughout his lumbo-pelvic area definitely needed some work, and he needed a little kind of tune up because he was totally disconnected from it. And then you explain that to him on the wall. It's like, well, think about it, like if your butt's away from the ball, and sometimes it needs to be with speed climbers because they have to get their legs up and everything. But there are moments on the wall or parts of the route that you have to be closer, with your hips. You have to be more upright to be able to generate power from a stability standpoint. And so like
it'll give you more length and reach at the same
exactly,
time. Right?
Yeah. And just telling him how that sets him up for the next move and the next move, and just like, basic things like center of mass and things like that. So, and he's already seeing, I mean, he's not like, getting his time down greatly, but it's all adding up in terms of how he feels a little bit more fluid on the wall, a little more like stable on the wall. And so for him, it was pretty interesting. Just something like, to go back to maybe your big question was the screen. Started with a little bit of programming, working with him regularly, and then observing, with his climbing and his off the wall exercises. So that's kind of like what my role is with these athletes, like gearing up towards Worlds, which is maybe backing up for these like really high potential Olympic qualifying athletes. We got sort of a plan for the season where our season starts in mid-April. And basically you're thinking about every other week, or every weekend or every other week, there's a competition, and it's usually international, it's abroad. So we go to Japan, Seoul, we come back home, and then we go to Indonesia, then we come back home for one competition, but then we're in Europe for like 6-7 weeks. And it's just back to back to back to back. So for them, what's kind of tricky is you have to do so many competitions. So let's say you don't qualify at Worlds, and I'll explain what that looks like. You have to do enough competitions and to do well enough at them to then get an invite in 2024 to do these qualifying series events. So that's like, if you say podium on one competition or two, you're probably good. Like you can probably call it quits, come back home and train. And so that's kind of what we're banking on, is they'll do less competitions this year. And if they get those spots, we'll actually come home a little bit early. We'll still have a team competing, but we'll kind of send our, I want to call them B team, but our other support staff, and I'll come home with them, and we'll focus on them training for World Championships, which will start in August. So for me, like what it mostly is right now, like, I got a couple that have like little niggles. Like I have, one that has a little bit of what I think is a little bit of joint mechanics issues. So she's getting a little bit of pain when she does like a heel hook maneuver. And we're just noticing her hamstring's really weak. And that's like, historically, there's been a hamstring strain last year. And so my sort of hypothesis, like she just hasn't gotten her strength in. She's feeling this sort of translation in her knee when she does a heel hook, and getting this sort of like, in her words, like her knee feels like it's going to break, which is an unusual way to describe it. Right. So I'm kind of gathering it's like an instability thing. And because otherwise it's not painful at all, so we're just trying to get those things dialed in before we get into the thick of the season. And then some of them have already gone through sort of their general strengthening, or kind of on the tail end of it. So the big lifts, deadlifts, usually most of them are like this athlete in particular needs to work on a lot of leg strength and power. So we just focused on that, deadlifts, squats. And some athletes do weighted pull-ups, and they'll do bench press, like the speed athletes. So that's kind of like where we'll tailor it, because some of them won't want to do them anyway. And they'll just come to you and say, can we work on this? And what should I do? And then we kind of develop the program for them. So
fantastic. I do have one question that you brought up about plyometric training, especially for the speed climbers, but it was primarily lower body focus.
Hmm.
What about upper body plyometrics?
Yeah.
What kind of things do you throw at them for that?
So a real popular one they already do is kind of, just rapid pull-ups. So that's one. I had them start doing med ball slams. So like, yeah, I have them doing both seated versions and then sort of a standing version, doing like maybe a diagonal pattern. Um, and so that's another one we do. Um, I don't do too much like pressing plyometrics other than I guess you could argue it's a little bit more lower body, but I'll have them do sort of the med ball throw up and jump. So just getting a lot of their, posterior chain and to just really facilitate the jumping part. But that's the thing is like we've been playing with a couple ideas. Like one, so especially speed climbing, right? It's kind of the sequence of okay, really drive with your legs, but then pull really hard with your arms, right? Or paddle through with your arms. And so like that's kind of where and maybe you have a really good opinion about this and a voice about this, but like I understand like if you simplify an exercise like a plyometric, you'll probably, let's say it's for lower body, you're doing box jumps. Like you're probably going to be able to drive a lot of power because it's so focused, it's very predictable, right? They've probably done it a million times. And so then if you make it a little too complex, like it might take away from that, right? Um, but we kind of start playing with the idea maybe once a week they do sort of a sequence of plyometrics. So it's like lower body to upper body, like a box jumps into a rapid pull up. And it's interesting because we just started this week because let's try to make it more sports specific and so and not so I won't say predictable, but something that challenges you like specific to what you're going to be doing on the wall. And it was just so interesting with this athlete. Like he then got really stumped. Like he kind of started to balk at just doing the box jump. He's like, well, I'm worried I'm going to like hit my shins. I was like, well, you're hopping on a box much lower than you ever hopped on. The only thing is you got to worry about as soon as you land is generate again and do the pull up. But he was already kind of like, you know, confused, I guess, if you will.
Yeah.
So and that's obviously something we got to like maybe dive into and see like how we can make that a little bit more attainable and maybe it's a little too complex, but it's just interesting like when you make the task just like add a little another element to it, then it's like all of a sudden like oh my gosh, but it in my mind it's simple, right?
Sure.
But that's
Oh,
kind of some ideas like and that's really for me a real fun part is coming up with these, they're not proven yet, I guess you could say, but it's just thinking outside the box of, yeah, like everyone's doing box jumps, everyone's doing, whatever, bounding and things, and they're all valuable, I think. And if you've mastered those, I think there's room like within a training cycle or phasing, like you can add these in. But you still would obviously have a period where like for instance, like the speed athlete is now entering his power phase. So we're going to start doing plyometrics. And I do have him start doing some of the basic stuff, more unilateral kind of box hops alternating to just drive from the one leg and start with there just to kind of get his power up a little bit and get his sort of his elasticity up. And then we'll progress to this more little complex thing as his, he starts to adapt a bit because he hasn't done them in a while. So
yeah, I love that you have just a wide field in which to create a blank canvas almost really,
yeah,
and you have so many colors to choose from to start
yeah.
to create this amazing masterpiece, so to speak. But Zach, this has been great. I can't believe this time has flown by, and it always does when I'm so engrossed in the topic. And with climbing, you drew me right in. So for the listening audience, they want to know more about USA Climbing. Can you just give us website as well as like contact information for yourself and so on?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, USA Climbing is basically based in Salt Lake City now. We have our headquarters there as our NGB, or national governing body, and we have our training center right next to our offices. Right now, it's a pretty rudimentary big warehouse, but it gets the job done for now. There is the hopes that we will have this multi-million-dollar facility in the future. That's kind of where we're leaning towards or trying to raise money for. And you can find me, you can email me at zack@usaclimbing.org, ZACK. And I'm also on Instagram with ZG as in George. Then my last name is DiChristino, which is a mouthful, but that's spelled DICRISTINO. I'm the physical therapist for the team and the medical manager. So.
Fantastic. Zack, this has been so much fun. I really appreciate it. The last question I have is, where do you like to climb? Because I don't see you as being an indoor climber. I see you just going out to the great outdoors somewhere in Colorado.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly, if I always have a choice, I would go outside. I mean, I think now because of my work schedule and traveling so much, I kind of just now have enjoyed climbing in any way. We have some really good gyms here, luckily, and I find it's really fun just to get on, some of these boulders that are similar in style to what these athletes are doing. Just to get, for me as the PT, it's kind of important to understand a little bit of the movement and the demands and of this new style of climbing. But if I have a choice, like I went down to Mexico, did some multi-pitch sport down there. But you'll usually find me, I'm going to usually abroad outdoor, some places like Kalymnos and China and Europe. And so that's kind of like where I really feel kind of at home.
Now you're just getting dirty and making me feel jealous. Zack, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd be glad to do it again if you want to.
For sure.
All right.
And that's it for another episode of the Zealous Podcast. I want to thank Zack for coming on and sharing everything that he did about climbing and what we can look forward to in the future. Speaking of the future, you should check out Perform Better's training summits. 3 days of incredible information for rehab strength conditioning, 4 locations around the country this summer. We've got Orlando, Florida, Chicago, Illinois, Long Beach, California, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to performbetter.com, check out their training summits, and while you're at it, go also to the NSCA.com website for the National Strength Conditioning Association, because their national conference is coming up this July, and it is also 3 days of amazing information, great learning, either in person or online. Go to NSCA.com for more information. We'll see you next week.